The Old School is brought to you by Ahart Solutions, which provides school surveys and applied research. More information at ahartsolutions.com. And good morning. Welcome to the Old School Podcast, a podcast about the American education system primarily, but we have been known to dip into other categories from time to time. But we go back to our tried and true. We go back to our bailiwick, our area of expertise. But we brought in someone who's even smarter than the two of us put together. With this in my endeavor is my good friend, Dr. Stephen Bourgeois. Good morning, sir.
Hey Miller, good to see you. You're all chipper. It's as if you have a spring in your step, even though you're sitting in a chair probably the whole day. But there you are, happy as hell. What's going on?
Well, I don't know if you know this or not, but this is the United States of America, and America's pastime has started once again. The turning of spring brings a man and woman's attention and thoughts and ideas and hopes and aspirations to maybe, perhaps, possibly their team will win the World Series. And so here I am, ready for the magic to happen.
Wow,
It's already started.
with hope in your heart and wings on your heels.
Exactly. And with us, would you like to introduce who's with us?
Yeah, I wanted to comment on how only 30 seconds to baseball. That's really impressive on your part. You showed so much restraint, and I think it is because we have a guest, more than a guest, a really good friend, a great friend, um, Ksenia and Filatov. But I want Ksenia to say her own name because I love hearing the accent. Would you please say your name to the old school podcast?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be back on this podcast. My name is Ksenia Filatov, and I'm currently in my nearing the end of my fifth year in the Curriculum and Instruction PhD program at Boston College, and formerly a teacher, like my great hosts here on this show.
Well, I do have a question because you've now entered a new stage of life. Is that still your last name?
Yes, I've kept my name.
Okay, very good. So
There's no hype.
congratulations on everything and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is really exciting, and you'll be proud to know that our last episode with you broke all records of listening. It probably doubled our number two, or pretty close. So we're always excited to have you here anyway. But you bring with you some clout because of your network and all these people, and you're also bringing other people to the podcast. You've introduced us, so you're an honored member of the podcast team. And one last thing, just as far as business, Ross is always talking about Instagram, and we have an Instagram account, but we also have a landing page under Ahart Education, and we might leave that in because we've looked back over the past, what has it been, 4 years, something like that.
Yeah, about that time.
Yeah, and put our guests down, and I thought, wow, I thought we've had a guest here or there. We had some pretty impressive folks there, and here we are, um, with Ksenia a second time. But yeah, so take a look at that because we've included coming soon, and next week we have a guest as well, and maybe towards the end, Ksenia can do a little tease by saying a few words about our guest for next week.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Well, why don't you jump in? Normally, we never have questions planned or anything, but you did something which we really liked was you shared an article that can be kind of the center of this. But why don't you frame this however you want, and we'll contribute, and you can drive.
Okay. Well, I mean, what I really wanted to talk about with you two today is this kind of trend in education. It's not necessarily a new trend, but I think with technological advancements and particularly artificial intelligence, it's accelerating. And it's a worrying trend for me. So I would call it something like a behaviorist uh, approach to education and learning. kind of a very narrow conception of learning, um, epitomized, I think, by this idea that learning is accomplished by undertaking a series of structured tasks that somebody has prepared for you and um, kind of adjusted to your precise developmental needs at a point in time. So I think, first off, I want to say there's merit in the idea that we should, adjust our instruction to individual needs, and personalized learning has a place in education. But I think what I'm seeing, and we'll talk about the article in a minute, is this um, increased control and surveillance over what children are doing, and trying to manage every single minute of their time. So I think early on we have something like this creeping into our discourse with phrases like um, on task time um, in classrooms. But yeah, that's the general topic.
So when you consider the term behaviorist, and for those in the listening audience who may not be as familiar with the term, is there a way that you can describe it perhaps in an area of American life or just life in general where people might see this kind of methodology?
Yeah, so I think um, the basic idea behind behaviorism is that um, kind of the only thing we can really observe and therefore control is visible behavior. And so that might be um, something like our behavior on social media, for example, what we search and what we like, what we comment on and how we comment. And in the classroom, that might be, um, looking at things like what a learner is doing at any given point, like whether they are speaking, maintaining eye contact or not, um, writing, looking, uh, walking around the room. So all the kinds of things that um, I think classically we would put under the umbrella of, well, I want to have an orderly classroom. I want to make sure everyone is concentrating and on task. And we kind of revert to this idea that, well, the way that I can tell that people are concentrating and learning is if what they are doing that is visible to me accords with my idea of what learning should look like. So typically that's something like maintaining eye contact with the teacher, or writing things down, um, or speaking with each other about uh, the topic that's the object of learning at a given point. So, it, as I said before, there's value, and
Mhm.
behavior certainly gives us important information about what might be happening in the educational process. But where it becomes reductivist is where we forget that there's a lot more going on than what is visible, um, and that is students' agency in the way that they actually process and make sense of the learning that's in front of them. And so, I think a great example is some research on particularly children who have been diagnosed with attention deficit hyper disorder or things like this, that when um, when children look like they're daydreaming or doodling or are off task in a narrow sense, they are actually making sense of the material, and they might be more on task in terms of learning than somebody who is speaking with another student, or it looks like they are writing down things. Um, so that would be, I guess, an example.
So from a kind of just a general idea, people are likely to come across behaviorist thinking with the algorithms that affect their iPhone, that affect their computer, their time that they spend, but that this same methodology is now being not now, it's been used before, is now being relayed into the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, one could even argue that behaviorism has been the dominant paradigm
Mm.
in the classroom for a long time. Um, so yeah, it's certainly not new. And where my concern is, and I guess where we find ourselves in today's episode, is really thinking about the ways in which technology can be used to amplify that reductive approach. Because one of the things that you can see quickly is that if you actually manage and hypermanage and control children's behavior in the classroom in the short term, you will see something like learning gains in the narrow way in which you choose to measure that. Um, but the long term problem with behaviorist strategies, first of all, is that they focus on extrinsic motivation. So if we think back to like some of the classical roots of behaviorism, I mean, it was Skinner, and also we've got, Pavlov and his classical conditioning. So classical conditioning works entirely on an extrinsic motivational basis.
I love the conversation. It's kind of my whole research agenda. I'm listening to it and thinking about these updates. Because I think you're right that the particularly AI and the more recent technologies, of surveillance, because the behaviors can be observed, and people who are walking through a classroom with a clipboard or a phone or whatever and evaluating the teacher, suddenly, they right now they can see the surface of it, the superficial. Are the students in their seats? Are they doing all these things? Are they using time in quotation marks well? um, but in as we move deeper into this, the surveillance is going to, it's not just the teacher, but the student. And I would like to think about how this approach is not, it's always been dangerous, but here there's something different about it, almost sinister, and I don't think I'm explaining it well. I think it'll come out of uh, an example or two, but
Yeah,
also um, it, from a teacher standpoint, a lot of teachers are going to think in terms of behavior, meaning manage the class, get them in their seats, uh, keep them under control so they're not disrupting the flow of the classroom. But then there's also learning, which is completely different. And so it's almost using a tool of managing where people sit and do, and then apply that same methodology to learning. Um,
right.
not necessarily an approach that, I mean, we shouldn't just let it slide and say, well, look at their test scores are up, they're in their seats. Isn't that what we wanted?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say that a lot of my thinking of this is largely um, in in a large part due to the wonderful book by Shoshana Zuboff called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. I recommend it to all our listeners because it essentially shows exactly how the behaviorist paradigm permeates the way that our technological advancement has worked, particularly in relation to our digital technologies, has worked over the last few decades.
So, Herr Miller, have you seen any of these types of controls applied maybe to the high school level? Because it seems like it lends itself to younger grades, but has that gotten into the classroom in the higher grades?
Well, I mean, if you think about how people have generally classified schools and characterized schools in the beginning in U.S. history with regards to public education, it was a lot about trying to prepare the kids for what they were likely to endure and deal with as adults, and that included life in industry. And so, you hear stories about that's why bells came in. Bells was basically the work whistle starting and ending the day, these kind of fragmented periods of time where the kids then shuffled off in such a way that Pink Floyd found it very easy to mock, and and another brick in the wall. But the idea that was that this was how we train our students, is this is how we train them to succeed in life, is get them used to this sort of thing. But I think anytime someone talks about classroom behavior and classroom management, there is an underscore that this is an attempt to try to control the situation within the classroom. And therefore, if it's a controlled classroom, it's a happy classroom, it's a productive classroom. With regards to your research, Ksenia, how does that, I mean, is this just simply an amped up version? As far as what you're seeing, is this kind of just an amped up version of what has always been there, or is there something different?
Yeah, I think maybe the more optimistic reading is that it's amped up.
Mhm.
And if you take Shoshana Zuboff's insights seriously, she would say it's a new version. And where it becomes a new version is when we have not just uh, you know various ways of controlling behavior more effectively in the classroom, but where we're using technologies that have advanced surveillance capabilities, um, and those technologies can then work back on us. And so she says the new um, kind of uh, uh, the form that's new, is that there is a behavioral modification that we are subject to, which is far less visible than in previous times. So if we compare, maybe it was the teacher with the school principal, it was the bells, it was things that were kind of visible and obvious in your environment. Um, but now that children are engaging with digital technologies, um, this kind of behavior modification is something that's happening a lot more um, seamlessly. And and in that way, I think its seamlessness and the way that it's becoming naturalized in the classroom makes it um, harder for people to see the problem in the way that Pink Floyd did, right? So there isn't per se someone or something clear that we can point to and say, well, this this is a form of control. Um, because now we are using these same digital technologies in our lives and we are consenting to various forms of control that we didn't necessarily think of as controlling us. We were thinking of them in terms of being tools, useful tools. So I think maybe we could go for the example. So Steve mentioned the article in the New York Times that I shared. So the article came out in February 4th this year, and it was titled, "Is Micromanaging Classes a Recipe for School Success?" And it tells a story about a Houston Public School District, um, which implemented a new program. The new superintendent who came in implemented a new program, which uses it's a classroom management software that both works on the children's devices and on a smart whiteboard in front of the room. And it's a management software that segments lesson activities into 30-second intervals, literally with a countdown on screens. So, unsurprisingly, when this was first implemented, uh, and this is why this article came out, there are, in fact, uh, gains in learning as visible on testing as a result of this. But both students and teachers are concerned that it's, sucking the life out of the um, classroom, essentially. So um, that would be one example.
And this certainly could be an extreme example, but at the same time, I think most people would say that there needs to be a level of control on the part of the teacher just for the class to be productive. The question is, how far does it make sense to extend that idea, and what works best or what works worse as far as that extension? I mean, what do you bring into the classroom? Steve and I have talked about over the years, and I know y'all have had conversations with regards to the way in which technology is used within the classroom, the way it's used in school. This does seem to be, though, at another level altogether.
Yeah. I think for contrast, we can ask the question, what are the conditions of learning in a classroom? And I think trivially, we can all agree that, you know, generally a calm environment is more conducive to learning, a calm, respectful environment where people are engaged and thinking about the object of learning. So, but we can also ask, okay, the conditions for what kind of learning? So, to give you completely from another spectrum, looking at the world of philosophy for children, for example, um, this begins very much. So, Philosophy for Children is a program that can start as early as kindergarten. And it could look something like 1 hour dedicated in a child's week, like a school week, or it could be integrated throughout their lessons. Um, but the basic idea is that it's a dialogical circle of inquiry, which includes free discussion as well as different thinking skill exercises throughout. So the way that you would set up the conditions for learning for this is gradually. I mean, I think every elementary school teacher is familiar with this idea of making a class contract where you actually ask the children, you know, what do you think are good things for us to do in order that we can learn well together and be well together in this space? And the children themselves will clearly tell you what the conditions are, right? So this is usually something that you would also begin um, it, start a philosophy for children program with, is that you actually talk to them about, okay, let's come up together with what we think are a set of conditions for us to partake in this conversation and this dialogue well. Um, and so they come up with a list, and as they engage in philosophical dialogue and you give them more and more tools of thinking, they begin to see that these tools of thinking are themselves creating the conditions of learning. So the tools of thinking might be something like asking questions, um, bringing in examples and counterexamples. So all of these are thinking um, tools that allow us to learn better together. On top of the obvious things like don't talk over each other, take turns, listen carefully to what somebody is saying before you respond. Make sure that you are responding in good faith to what somebody has said, right? So, this is also a way of thinking about what are the conditions of learning in this classroom, right? Another way of thinking about the conditions of learning in this classroom is everybody feeling well and has everybody had breakfast? that's that's another question you might ask when you're wondering about the conditions of learning. So these are just contrasts that show you, okay, what we have to ask ourselves, what kind of learning are we after? Because when you start to move towards the space of project-based learning, problem-based learning, inquiry-based learning, your classroom is going to look more chaotic because free experimentation, play, and flow is part of that process, and it's what enables learning to happen. But a classic case, this is something that used to happen in a school that I taught in. We had a dedicated time to reading that was taken out of a lesson of English. I think once every few weeks, you would take your class to the library, and the whole lesson, the children would just read. And the library is a silent environment, which is conducive to everyone reading. So yes, what kind of learning do you have in mind when you are thinking about the conditions of that learning? I think is important.
It feels like, from the article, first of all, that in Houston, they took about half of their schools with this regimented, and I would suspect that these are the more economically disadvantaged which is just what we would hypothesize. The more controlling aspects would be to the less affluent groups. And so there's a whole lot of baggage that goes with that. But the methodology also includes, it's very simple in a way. I mean, there's instruction, there's you send two students together with a timer and they supposedly talk about the lesson, and then they go, and then there's assessment. And so assessment becomes constant. It's not like, here's your annual test, let's get ready for it. But there's just so much. And then there's regrouping, meaning the people who are really low, you move over here now. And the people who are doing fine, they don't accelerate. They're not trying to move people ahead of each other, and that's a control function also. So they're actually retarding the learning of the best students to manage the class. Um,
Mm.
that way it can move forward. Otherwise, you lose control, right? Because suddenly you have students who are, the haves and the haves not. They're actually getting more
Yeah.
behind, and then management is a problem. So there's this pressure to conform and lower the top and raise the bottom. Um, and interestingly, yes, the state test scores have gone up, but I imagine they're taking the NAEP, a national assessment, is still flatlined. Um, so there's a lot of things you can do to pass one test, which is what they're doing, I guess, draconian efforts for this one test. But all of these little assessments, constantly, and I think that's where the AI can come in, is that it's going to be able to do that assessment more intuitively, and it's just going to be a constant assessment, so eventually, the teacher role, they're not going to be as prominent. They're probably going to take the next train to the coast, you know. That's what I imagine.
Yeah, and I think, to the point earlier about how um it's less kind of clear who is or what are the things that are kind of controlling you in this way. The same applies to the teachers. I mean, there's obviously a feeling here like something doesn't feel right. This isn't quite what my vision of education is, right? Um, so I feel uncomfortable with it, um, to put it mildly. Um, so I think, yeah, it's part of the problem with technology is I think it very gradually obscures these larger questions about what is your vision for education? What is your vision for learning in this classroom, in this school, in this district? And testing is another example of a technology that does exactly that by, um, reducing all learning to a mere snapshot of the learning, um, or some kind of learning at a given point in time.
Yeah, it compartmentalizes it to the minutia. The testing is, Ross and I talk a lot about assessment, and we think the superior is allowing students to think and write, and they're difficult to grade, but that shows what they're actually thinking. To me, the low point of the article, and there are a lot of them, is picturing the superintendent himself with his team of suit-wearing staff walking into a classroom, and then they're pulling the teacher aside, and the only wisdom they can say is, "I would have liked to see a little more of that pair and share." And the teacher would say, "Well, thank you, superintendent. I never thought of it that way. Good little critique of my teaching. Thank you so much." And then they nod and walk out. That's where, that scene will happen, because somebody without a pretty low ceiling on teaching intellectually, whatever you want to call it, can make all kinds of nice comments about that, but they really don't know much about learning. Because they're looking at the surface. It's all surface.
Right. And that demonstrates the limits of this of reducing everything to behavior. Like you, just because you've seen a little bit of behavior of this classroom in terms of what was happening, it doesn't mean that you understand the life of the classroom or what learning means for the teacher and the students. And so, yeah, your comments will be trivial precisely for that reason. Yeah.
Well, I'd
I
like,
don't know what it says about
yeah,
the fact that Steve and I have probably been together too long because I had highlighted the exact same part of the article
yeah.
to kind of because what it does is it turns all this stuff into a dog and pony show that means nothing to nobody except for the appearances that something is happening rather than the reality that something is happening.
Yes.
There
Yeah.
needs to be a way to self-regulate in that. I mean, that has to be the lesson eventually as you get out of college or high school or anything. You have to be able to set limits. I'm thinking of something that I've tried. It hasn't worked, but it's actually, I think it's called Pomodoro. It's this thing where it sets a 20-minute time limit where you work, and then you get a little alarm, and then you're supposed to stand up and take a break. Um, and so if you get locked into something more than that, you still have to stop and walk away because apparently it makes you more efficient. So it's used in the workplace, but it's self-imposed. um, I tend to go over that 20 minutes and close the window and just keep working, you know, eventually. But another example, actually, when I was doing my dissertation study and I was talking to academically gifted students, one of them would have her cell phone next to her, and she would turn it down. So the face screen was down, and she would be reading and working, and whenever it would buzz, she couldn't touch it. That was her rule for herself, and she kept reading and studying, and then at the very end, after her session is over, then she can turn it over. And so that's a discipline, and it's you know the self-regulation. It still uses some behaviorist tools, but you're imposing them on yourself. And if they're coming from the outside, I think that's another reason why they won't stick, as they leave the school setting.
Yeah. I mean, one way of looking at it is they won't stick in terms of learning achievement necessarily, but what might stick is the expectation that somebody else will be imposing discipline on you. So I think that's really the difference between your examples and what's going on here. So, you know, discipline has a place in our life, obviously. Um, you know, discipline is part of how we achieve our goals, whether these are mastery goals or virtue goals or what have you. So I think I definitely agree that we do implement some of these tools to train ourselves. But we have set the goals
Mhm.
for, we have determined what the goals are, hopefully. And when we are young, somebody wiser has suggested to you what the goals are. So, every musician knows that, the way to freedom and mastery in the craft is through discipline. So it certainly has a place. Um, but yes, one of the outcomes might be that in the absence of these disciplinary crutches imposed by you, um, it you essentially fall apart and you fall victim. And maybe a very sinister reading of this is that uh, tech companies want us to be dependent on them for these kind of disciplinary goals. And so this is part of the pipeline that they're creating from an early age.
So it seems as if every once in a while, a school district will make news because they're trying something new or they're trying something different or they're trying something that for whatever reason no one else has paid attention to anywhere else in the country. And often it is something that's either done in isolation to other things that have to accompany it in order for it to be productive. We have talked before about the idea that Heidegger's notion that teaching is difficult because because the task for the teacher is to only allow learning to take place, only to allow the learning of whatever it is that you're set out to do for that to take place. And that anything else can have the potential of one, ruining the learning, but two, having something else encroach on it. I'm not being very eloquent here, but the idea is that you talked about the idea that what we're doing is we're telling the kids that their own level of self-discipline is not as important as somebody else controlling them. And that's when they have a possibility of falling apart when they leave school.
The, in Heidegger's term, he says lernen lassen, to let learn, and which is completely different than these systems. There's no letting anything. It's ensuring. It's um, using all kinds of rewards, and in the article they probably don't even get into their group rewards, and I guess they put their achievement on the wall. But that's not letting learn. I'm glad you brought that up, Ross, because I think that those are two completely different ideas, and maybe there's something in the middle where yes, you can keep kids from climbing the walls in a classroom, but also allow some type of learning and teaching, because none of this actually it's scripted. I mean, you could have a robot or a screen, with somebody talking for what do they get, like 10 minutes of instruction. Why don't they just have the voice talking to them? They're on the little pads, then they turn and talk to the other, but maybe the other is going to turn into a generative AI screen. Talk to your generative AI bot next to you. They'll challenge you a little bit. I want to push back on that, Steve. Okay. So suddenly there is no other. It's just the student, and again, why we it's solving a problem, and Ross and I always talk about a certain problem that has to be solved, but it's clearly creating something ominous, and this is not going to take years and years and years to develop. So this is a scary development because it's successful, and politically um, a lot of people are behind this. I think that we're in the minority criticizing this. A lot of people would say, "Okay, well, why don't you give me more of that?"
Well, yeah, and again, it's about your, what defines success.
Mhm.
I mean, one of the issues, and all teachers and district leaders, principals are subject to these pressures, is that, and even researchers at the university, is that the expectation of uh, quick results on a very narrow measure um, is really what's driving these kind of I think experiments and attempts. Um, so the other big theme I think around here is our relationship with time, and uh, our relationship with time in terms of what is expected to be achieved um, at a given point in time. And also, and Steve and I talked about this, the emotional uh, kind of feedback loop that we have with time as well. So consider the very presence of a countdown, a visual or oral countdown um, in your life. So it's something that almost immediately induces a kind of anxiety and and acceleration and stress. And so that means that you are utilizing a stress fear um,
Mhm.
feedback loop
Yeah.
in order to engender certain behaviors so that you can get the outcome you desire. Um, and so when you step back from that and really look at the big picture, I mean, this is going to sound really grim, but essentially, um, uh, some people have decided that success means um, raising these test scores, and we need to train students to perform at these test scores. And it essentially we or the adults in this situation are using the children to meet a narrowly defined goal. And so the student's agency is not at all present in this equation. It is nowhere in this article at all. So students don't like what they're being subjected to, and so we're seeing that they do have a response to this and a reaction to this. But surely a quick way to suppress someone's agency is to engage them in this perpetual anxiety-inducing countdown situation in every single class they encounter. So, yeah.
It is strange. You listen to or you read the rest of the article, and we will link the article in the description below when we post this. But the, you know, it comes across as this rather Orwellian type of setup, and the reaction by the parents is both emotive and also understanding in the sense that they're worried that their kids are miserable, and that Steve and I have talked about the dangers of being of school being fun, but there's a wide chasm between fun and this rather the word y'all been using, ominous kind of vision of what education should look like. I understand that all this stuff is coming from a good place, but the problem is that if I can take it back to the general, is this notion that education leaders seem to not be able to think beyond the short term. And when we talk about learning and learning goals and the value of learning and how it changes people and how it can help shape people to become learners, and all those little catchphrases that schools have as their school motto, that includes lifelong learning and critical thinking. All of this stuff is the product of long-term thinking. It is the product of long-term goals and long-term ideas.
Mhm.
And the fact that everything seems to be boiled down to these short-term 30 seconds, 30, I don't know what, the extent of it is, but the fact that everything is boiling down to these short-term gains and that this is what we should champion, it's just asinine to me. And in as far as what I take from this article and what I look at I look at the landscape in general, it has to do with more of an institutional problem, that because we've turned education into a political paradigm, that it is now impossible for education leaders to think beyond, you know, 3 months in front of them and what the test scores are going to reveal.
I like the concept of time in this discussion because the whole methodology that has been posited, if you take the timer out of it, and then suddenly it can breathe, and those discussions can be longer, but the time element is prevalent, and a superintendent has a short shelf life. They need to show something very, very quickly. I think Ross and I wrote about this, just this sort of cycle of control, which is really obvious in a way, that superintendent has a direct control over the school leaders who are using the same methodology and the focus on test scores down to the teachers, and they're incentivizing the teachers with merit pay based upon this A to F system and value add. And then it works its way down to the students, and then those students are going to become lousy parents because they're going to apply these methods and little gamification. That's another pet peeve. But the gamification is going to become more prevalent also, particularly if you're using a screen. So I don't have anything good to say about this except for there is some order in the classroom. That's it.
Well, we talk about the idea about, what constitutes order. I think most teachers, most good teachers who are introspective, when I first started teaching, I taught, well, I like teachers taught me, and it was heavy centric as far as on the teacher side of things. But as far as I got older and as I started to see the cause and effects, you realize that the kid doodling is still listening, that the kid doodling is still paying attention. And it's about just easing up just a bit to be able to allow students to kind of approach things in their own way. You'll find out that in the end, they still have an understanding of what it is that you wanted them to know and to learn. It's just, you would think adults, especially older adults who become superintendents, you would think at some point there would be kind of an easing off based upon experiences that suggest that having a firm dictatorial, and I don't want to overcharacterize this because I'm reading an article and I don't know the ins and outs, and I don't know exactly what's going through this Mr. Dr. Miles. I don't know what's going through his mind, but so I don't want to overgeneralize my perception of him. But I would just think that as you grow older, you would learn to kind of understand that you maybe need to take a step back. And I'm kind of confused as to how this has come to be, but it's pretty evident and evidential throughout the entire school system.
In a way, you can win the battle but lose the war. And this superintendent has improved test scores, but then he's um, a lot of his constituents are against him at the point where they had a very large bond issue, $4.4 billion that they desperately needed, and the parents were so upset with this program that they, overwhelmingly voted against the bond. So these test scores are part of what his job, but the other part is to keep things running financially. So the writer of the article is implying that these things may have a short shelf life also for all these different factors.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, to your earlier point about things becoming political, I think I want to say that education has never been not political, really.
Well, yes,
Um,
yes.
in the larger sense that um, any kind of education we have is an expression of our, or of the government's
Hmm.
aspiration for what social life should be, right?
Hmm.
And so we can also kind of step back and ask the question, what kind of learning, what kind of education, what kind of success in learning is required so that we have a viable democracy? That's another question we can ask. And so um, any kind of effort to control, subjugate, um, make compliant is a reflection of somebody's aspiration of what kind of citizen we want to have as well.
Well,
Well, I don't know what the end game with regards to Houston is, or how it'll be interesting to see what the ramifications of the objections are. The fact that there are objections to it, how far will that go? Um, again, I find it a bit difficult to believe that this has a long shelf life, but I've been mystified before. I'm sure I will be again.
constantly, yeah. But the variable of the technology that you call it an accelerator. I think in this case, this type of this is the future. If I were betting on it, that the more humane approach. But people are going to be leaving traditional schools. I mean, this has probably populated private schools, certain charter schools in the Houston area. They're probably voting with their feet. And this feels like one of those examples of shutting down public education, bringing in somebody to save it. But essentially, I mean, this man also has run charter school organizations. So politically, he's probably not even interested. And I'm probably being way unfair, but this has that feel to it. That this is attacking the core of public education.
And I think it's important to point out that um, voting with feet is the purview of the privileged in many cases. So I mean, you're probably all familiar with different kinds of charter schools. Maybe a relevant example here is something like the no excuses charter schools.
Yeah.
So when we're in a situation where public schools are closing down and being replaced by charter schools, typically in areas of high poverty,
Hmm.
this is not a situation in which people can vote with their feet. They
Yeah.
This is the school they get.
Right.
This is all they have. So yeah.
Well, so we need to come back to this topic, and then we have so much more to discuss, and it's like endless. It's a like this world that in some ways talking about this, we're not going to end up in a corner because, this has other implications well beyond this conversation. And, and I'm not going to be depressed about it. I was looking forward to it, and I'm happy that we talked about it. I'm also happy, Ksenia, that you introduced us to Dr. Patrick McQuillan, and maybe, we can tease the next episode because you know him really well. And I had about a 30-minute conversation with him myself after the introduction. But maybe you can give our audience and us a little bit of how exciting this is going to be next week.
Yeah, so Dr. Patrick McQuillan is a wonderful mentor and friend of mine. I connected with him before I even started my doctoral studies at Boston College. So he's now retired from BC. And the work that we connected over is now, the outcome of that work is the book that he'll be talking about. So this is a longitudinal ethnographic study of school leadership. So Patrick was, or Pat was involved in the Lynch Leadership Academy at Boston College, which educates or brings together school principals and exposes them to various leadership practices. And he followed a number of leaders throughout their work after graduating from the academy. And it's really exciting. And my contribution to this work was minimal. It's right at the very end. So Pat and I spent a number of months in dialogue, and what we were building together was kind of tool that we hope school leaders can use in order to begin a transformative process. So his new book is called Complexity Theory and Educational Leadership in Schools. So it is essentially he's applying the lens of complexity theory, so looking at schools as living systems and how leaders can work with that dynamic, and not only leaders, but always in collaboration with their faculty and other staff and students and parents. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that preview. And his approach is going to be the opposite of what we just discussed today. So that's exciting too. Well,
Very much so, very much so. It's about, horizontal, ground level, distributed leadership. This is really what it's about. And not only thinking about, I think, the learning of our students, but the learning of the system as a whole, right? The intelligence of the system as a whole, that includes everyone in it, including teachers and leaders and so on.
I
wonderful.
must say, as we close things out for today in the Old School Podcast, I have to say, I don't find myself as pessimistic about this as my good friend Steve might be. We often kind of characterize ourselves as the two old guys on the Muppet Show sitting in the balcony just criticizing everything. But I feel like with the work that Ksenia is doing, the work that Dr. McQuillan has done, I think the work that professors like Jonathan Haidt has done with his work with regards to what technology should look like in the classroom. There is a growing list of states and countries that are starting to make moves against the notion of certain kinds of technology within the educational sacred spaces of our classrooms. I am not as pessimistic as maybe I would have been 10 years ago. I think that there is reason to believe that we might be seeing a change. Let's just hope that it continues. So, well, Ksenia, thank you so much
Yeah.
for joining us. Thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing your expertise and your thoughts on all these matters. Really appreciate you being on with us today.
Thank you. This is always enjoyable. I hope to be back soon.
And
Indeed.
Yes. And we look forward to everyone. Follow us on Instagram at the Old School Podcast 2021. Take a look at our website, the ahearteducation.com. It's part of the platform that kind of showcases everything that we've done and we are going to be doing in the next few weeks and months. And with all that, I should say adieu, Herr Dr. Bourgeois.
Wiedersehen, Herr Miller. And thanks again, Ksenia.
Tschüss.
Peace.